A child reaches a finger tentatively out towards a fire. "Don't," says its sibling, "it'll really hurt." "Don't tell me what to do," says the first child. "I'm sick of you always telling me what to do." "It'll really hurt, you'll get really badly burned," the sibling warns. In pops their sneery uncle, who has just distracted their parents in the other room, so they aren't here to see this. "Do it," he sneers. "It'll be lots of fun." The child touches the fire. It hurts. It's interesting, though, and it feels pretty good to have the support of a trusted family member to do something reckless, but it hurts. "Fun, isn't it?" says the sneery uncle, and pushes the child into the fire. The child screams. "Sorry," says the uncle, "you made your decision. Now you have to stand by it if you're so grown up." The parents run in to see what the screaming is about. Uncle's holding the child in the fire, not letting them go. Well, I guess you made your decision," say the parents, and leave the house. Flames jump outwards and catch. The house goes up. The fire brigade arrive. "Well, you made your decision," they say. "I'm sorry, but you should have thought about this." The fire spreads across the neighbourhood. "We had nothing to do with this," the neighbours complain as their houses burn down as well. The fire brigade have a go at saving their houses, but it doesn't really work. The sibling screams and screams as they both burn to a crisp. "Why wouldn't you listen?" they ask. "Because I'm sick of having to listen to you just because people think you're cleverer than me," are the child's last words, before both of them are silenced, when everyone's vocal cords mutually bubble away into nothing. Okay, that felt good. It's good to have a rant. We've all been having rants. But the situation is a bit more nuanced than that, and it's important to talk about how we shouldn't just be angry at each other, so here we go. Hello! You may have noticed that the UK has rather fallen to bits in the last few weeks, and that's because we voted to leave the EU. Well, most of us didn't. I didn't. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, but the fallout isn't. Our country's in a nosedive, racist attacks have rocketed up, and both our government and its opposition have just sort of collapsed. Since I recorded that, we've now got a new Prime Minister, and the government is putting itself together again. The opposition, though, is still crumbling, and nobody knows what's going on over there. There's basically no way for a video like this to still be up to date by the time I finish editing it. Well, I think I'm about to talk about that, so. There's more news about all this every day, which is why it's taken me this long to talk about it. I was kind of waiting to see if it all would settle down, and it isn't doing. And why is that? And why does it matter? Some of my non-UK subscribers have been asking me to talk about it for some reason. I'm no expert, but here goes anyway. If you live in, America, say, or somewhere where it doesn't really matter directly to you, you may have heard that one country has decided to change the terms of its trade agreement with a bunch of other countries, and why is a big fuss being made about that? Well, the reason why it happened, is that a lot of other subjects got tangled up in the whole question of whether we should be in the EU or not. And of course, people are now angry at one another. There are voters on one side angry at voters on the other side, and those voters are angry at those voters, and it's all becoming an ugly mess where lots of people in the UK sort of distrust lots of other people in the UK, and whenever there's a big divisive issue, it becomes very tempting to vilify the people who disagree with you on it. And really, that's been one of the main characteristics of the whole mess, both leading up to the vote and now leading away from it, and we need to get over that. We really need right now to stop thinking that, like, the other guys are bad guys, because they're not. They're not. But there are bad guys. And we've seen many of them resign in the last few weeks, and new ones are about to come in, and they're bad guys as well. Let me start again. First of all, what actually happened? Well, imagine there's a decision, and this decision doesn't necessarily need to be made, like, not right now. It's not a time-sensitive decision. There's no emergency that's happened that means that it has to be made now. But it happened to benefit the careers of a couple of powerful politicians and a couple of powerful media companies to convince, like, a lot of the public that it does need to be done right now, so they're going like, it needs to be done right now. So imagine if the future of your country's economy, and maybe the world's economy, would be really dramatically affected if this decision was made. Imagine it affects everyone in the country. Put in that position, how would you go about deciding whether to make the decision? Well, this affects everyone in the country, so the answer's obvious. You do it democratically. We have a system for that. And the system is, you gather the representatives that the people have voted to speak for them democratically, and you tell them to gather information, consult experts, take the general temperature of public opinion, and decide, because this is what their job is as an elected representative, decide whether it would be in the best interests of the people they represent to make the decision. That's roughly what the democratic model is. That's not what we did. Instead, Prime Minister David Cameron put it to a referendum because he'd promised to put it to a referendum in order to get votes. That, if you don't know, is a yes-no vote that everyone gets to participate in, but we've only done this 3 times. Ever. This time it was given all of the campaigning and coverage and setup of a general election, so that's how people thought of it. And as a result, even though it's not actually legally binding, if the government don't do what the result of the referendum said, well then it's going to look like they're being undemocratic, which is usually fine if the result is overwhelmingly in one direction or the other, like it was in the first of the other 2 times we've ever done this before, which was when we voted to join the EU in the first place. That was an overwhelming vote. I think it was like 60 or more than 60% voted to join the EU, so there we go, that's a yes. Stamp the paper, yes, done. But this time, with this referendum, there were a couple of problems. Firstly, the vote was not overwhelming. I think it was something like 3-point-something% majority. It's still a majority, but when you're using that 3-point-something% to determine the fate of everyone, a whole country, do you see what I mean? It's not as decisively democratic as you'd like. It blurs the lines a bit. And secondly, and this is the key point, the winning vote was the one that nobody had a workable plan for. And they hadn't made a plan because no one expected that side would win, including the people who campaigned for it. All of the experts entirely agreed that if we did vote to leave the EU, and they all agreed that we shouldn't, then it would be pandemonium. And all the things those experts said would happen, by the way, are happening. They were right. But nobody listened to them because the 3 or 4 politicians who convinced voters to vote leave said you shouldn't listen to experts because they think they're cleverer than you, those experts, and you're sick of hearing that, aren't you?
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms
people in this
saying...
country have had enough of experts.
That sort of anti-intellectualism in politics, by the way, ought to be familiar to Americans because it's the reason you're going to vote Trump into power. Where you have Trump with his TV-friendly chattering that attracts attention and support because it sounds non-presidential, even though it's total rambling nonsense and is dangerously racist and so on, we had Nigel Farage.
This is an actual picture of him and not a comedian depicting an English aristocrat.
The leader of a far-right party whose only thing is convincing the public to distrust and dislike the EU, and whose main tactic for doing that is by blurring the lines in the public understanding between, like, the EU and just anything that isn't England. You know, those foreigners you get now coming over here. Anyway, so why, you might be wondering, would the politicians want to use sneaky tactics of that sort or any sort to convince the public to vote for a decision that all of the experts have said would put the country that they're politicians of, in financial jeopardy? Why would they want to do that? Well, as it turns out, the whole thing was a show. They were actually banking on losing the vote and then stabbing each other in the back politically until one of them ended up in the Prime Minister's seat with Cameron gone. It was all personal power grabbing. And if it seems a weird political move to attempt to lose a vote, I want to show you Trump again. I've never been convinced that he actually wants to be the president. I think the whole time he was just trying to whip up just enough support so that when he loses the presidency, he can spend the rest of his life selling stuff with his name on it and phrases like "Make America Great" to that frothing fan base who are all sort of whipped up and angry that they lost, and, you know, they'll be dedicated to him for life. He'll be, as a brand, he'll be extremely strong, and he can do the, you know, interview circuit, and he can write books about the campaign and autobiographies and that sort of thing. That's what I've always thought Trump was in it for, and now I think it's just gone too far. You can't imagine he's the sort of person who actually wants to do the work involved in being a president, can you? Anyway, maybe I'm wrong about that, but you see the point. It can happen. Someone can make a political move that they appear to lose, but actually they win. Well, back to the referendum. There was a huge problem with this referendum. The question being asked was, should the United Kingdom stay in the EU or should it leave the EU? And that sounds simple, doesn't it? But when it comes down to it, really, almost none of us knew what we were voting for or against. You've probably heard already that the day after the results of the referendum were announced, Google reports a huge spike in people Googling the phrase, "What is the EU?" As a result of that, and because there's been a lot of people who voted to leave and are now saying like, well, I didn't think this would happen, there's been a lot of rhetoric being thrown around that goes a bit like, well, they should have educated themselves. But honestly, no, they shouldn't. Yeah, it was really important for the country, so it was vitally important that everyone know what they were about to vote for or against. And I educated myself to the best of my ability, so, with that privilege, I am here to say that I shouldn't have had to. It should have been very, very clear. There should have been little else on TV for about a month leading up to it. Every billboard that you see as you drive around shouldn't have had meerkats on them. They should have had solid information about what the EU is, what it does, what we would have left if we didn't have it. Factual information, not put there by the Brexit campaign or the Remain campaign, but by, like, universities, like people who have the actual knowledge and facts. Every skip in 5 seconds YouTube advert should have been dedicated to it. Every computer, phone and tablet should have had information about it on the shutdown and startup screens. Everyone should have been made to know what was going on, because the future of the economy has been forced to depend on what their opinion was. Just their opinion, just out of their gut feeling, out of their heart, out of nothing. No, actually, not just out of nowhere. It was put there. We were manipulated. See, the EU it's a really complicated thing, right? It's about international politics and international trade. Those are things that I'm not clever enough to understand. That's why I'm not running the world. That's why we have an EU full of people who understand that sort of thing. It's why we have experts in things. It's because there are things that are more complicated than you can rely on your gut feeling about. And our gut feelings as a nation on which this vote turned, if they were informed at all, they were informed by confusion and misinformation. And I don't just mean that in the usual sort of old media manipulation sort of way. No, the Out campaign, the Brexit campaign, which won, did so apparently entirely on the back of lies which it told the people who voted for it. Maybe I'm missing some details, but as far as I can see, everything that they promised would be the upshot of a Leave vote, a Leave result, they've admitted just days or sometimes hours after winning the vote were just invented out of thin air. They're just not actually true. Now, some of these have become famous for being lies, like the 350 million quid that they said we pay to the EU each week when we didn't, and which they said would now be able to go to funding the NHS, when it won't. And then there's the one about the idea of being able to control immigration after we leave the EU, when actually our ability to control immigration is now significantly less. But there are less famous lies that swung the vote as well, like the one about EU legislation being made by unelected bureaucrats. That one's not true. Far as I can tell, the EU legislation is actually made by a room full of delegates from elected governments, which used to include ours, along with a European Parliament elected by its citizens, which previously included us. The closest thing to that is true is that our law, UK law, does still have to go through a house of unelected aristocrats. Another lesser known fib was the one about Turkey being about to join the EU, which it wasn't.
Yeah, Turkey. See what I mean about news constantly happening? We don't know what's going on in Turkey right now, but this was recorded before it, so let's just move on.
But if it was, when we were a member of the EU, we had the ability to veto it. Well, now that we've left the EU, in this and any other situation in the future, the best we could do is to stand and make speeches about it at them and sort of urge them what we think they ought to do, instead of actually being able to make the decision ourselves, which is a right we've now relinquished. Another fib that still has legs and not everybody knows it's a fib is the one about how 60% of our law comes from Brussels, when it just doesn't. And I mean, it just doesn't. There's no real way of explaining why, because it doesn't. It's just a made up number. And all of this is possible, and it's going to keep happening, because we don't have anything that polices political fibs. We have an advertising standards agency whose job it is, for instance, to stop McDonald's from claiming that a Big Mac is health food, but we don't have anything like that for politics. So I suppose my point is, in the face of all that, why the hell is anyone blaming Joe Voter for not having all of the information? The whole point of this is the information is bigger than Joe Voter. You have to train to understand what the EU is. You have to have years and years of experience to really understand the ramifications of this. And to even just scratch the surface in like a layman way, you have to do a lot of tedious reading of complicated things written in a posh language, and you have to know that the source you're reading is trustworthy, because all of the sources that are pushed in your face, all the sources that are most readily available are not trustworthy. All the papers were, either in the pocket of or just sort of politically aligned with one or the other side of the argument. It's a huge pain to educate yourself, and I can't swear that I'm clever enough to do it. I tried, I didn't enjoy it, and I only got, so far, and I could barely understand what I did read, and I'm, halfway intelligent. Let's assume that I'm somewhere on the middle of the curve. You're looking at loads of voters who just never had a chance of understanding this, but whose opinion was still going to sway the future of, the economy and international politics, things that they can fundamentally never properly understand. So why should we chastise them now? It's simply not their fault. Especially when, and this is the most important point, they were being lied to. This does not make them fools or dupes or put any blame on their table whatsoever for what happens now. The fact is, we are not equipped to deal with lies on this scale made to us by people with this amount of trust. Yes, it's possible to arm yourself against this sort of thing, but as a whole country, what we've gone through is a form of gaslighting. Thousands of people have been successfully convinced that things that just aren't happening are an immediate threat. And when that fear is put into people and then has an outcome, the blame for that outcome goes to the people who told those lies. If this ends up going as badly as it is doing so far, it will be the fault of those politicians and not of the people who trusted them. So, the easy thing now, the knee-jerk thing, which we shouldn't do, is for those of us who voted Remain to look at the economic fallout and on everything that's happening and decide that the people who voted Leave are stupid. Or racist, that's the other one, since the Leave campaign was driven by fear of immigrants as much as anything else. And we all know what issues and prejudices are always going to get mixed into that particular broth. The resulting image is of a country full of people who'd be prepared to tank their own economy if it means less Polish people. But of course the UK is a real place and the people in it are real. And yeah, there are racists here and there are stupid people here, but people are more complicated than that, and I think we all know it. So don't fall for it and let yourself go around saying that the Leave voters were stupid. They did what we all did. They acted on the information that they had. But we have to acknowledge where most of that information came from, and that it turns out to have been lies. Any of us could have voted for this if we believed that because something is sold as a newspaper, then it's important and telling the truth. Because that's a big part of what happened here. At least 3 of the most prominent newspapers in the country were pro-Brexit, and they ran pro-Brexit headlines. Now maybe as those papers start to report on the repercussions, because goodness knows there's not a lot else to report on right now, maybe their readers will start to realise, finally, how nasty those papers are and how dangerous it is to listen to them. For the last several years, the parts of our media that works by increasing people's stress had been blaming British working class poor people for all the country's problems. To what end, I don't know. But they found recently that by switching to blaming foreign people, and by foreign people I mean people in the UK who you think look foreign, and all that implies, suddenly thousands of people got into the voting spirit. And the buying newspapers spirit. And the buying Union Jack paraphernalia spirit. I can only imagine the Mail has stakes in that stuff as well. But I'm not without bias here. I already distrusted those papers, I already read up on the EU, and I voted Remain. So to make this video, in order to make it as fair as I possibly could, I wanted to talk to people I knew who voted to leave. Because I know they're good people, and not racist, and not stupid. And what I found is that generally, they're not happy right now either. They didn't vote for this. They voted for the best version they could cobble together of what was going on from all of the nonsense being yelled at them, same as us, trying to look between the rhetoric before we knew how much of it was lies. They weren't fools, even the ones who were fooled by the Mail. They did the exact same thing that Remain voters did. They took into account that the media exaggerates and tries to stir up our stress and our anger and our fear, and they tried to see through that. And the thing is, getting through a maze of lies is always difficult, especially when it's important that we all get through. Because people find different routes through. It's inevitable that we all won't get through the exact same way. So they did think that the claims about immigrants filling up our country were exaggerated, for instance. But using the same logic, they thought that the claims about, total economic meltdown if we were to leave the EU must be hyperbolic as well. Especially since they often went hand in hand with claims about how one side of the vote was racist and terrible and lying, and the other side of the vote was full of expert geniuses. Of course that looked like nothing but spin. They did see people voting Leave just because they thought brown people were taking their jobs. But they saw people vote Remain just because they thought working class people were less intelligent. They saw people vote Leave because their racist mates told them to. But they saw people vote Remain because J.K. Rowling told them to. And when it comes down to it, how is that any more intellectual? Remain voters noisily predicted inequality and austerity and horror if we left the EU. And Leave voters saw all of that already here and wondered if the fault might not lie in laws being made out there, written by people in the council in the clouds who aren't here to see it. A Leave voter said something that I can't stop thinking about, which is that they wish it was possible to vote somewhere in the middle, to vote for the things you actually think on a sensible scale, instead of being forced to vote hard in one direction or the other, and be forced to take on all the baggage that your side comes with as if you consented to that. Now, as it goes, it may be possible to get this right and end up with a better situation at the end than we had before. Nobody has a plan for how to do this yet, so it's a bit like jumping out of a plane without a parachute and hoping to be able to just happen to grab the materials to stitch one on the way down. But it could happen, maybe. It's not like we're any less in control of what happens to us now, and we've lived this long. A lot of the warm, happy childhood nostalgia that people around my age hold dear and publicise on the internet happened under Thatcher and the imminent threat of nuclear war. So you never know. But even if you look on the bright side, there is still something to be really sad about. Some people think that the anguish currently being expressed by Remain voters is because they're sore losers who didn't get their preferred side of a coin flip. But it's more than that. We lose coin flips all the time. You know, we try and find out what's going on and then we hope the bad things don't happen, but they always do because someone always convinces people to vote for bad ideas. Most of the dismay is at what is actually happening right now in real life. The economy is going wrong, racist attacks are on the rise, but a huge part of what we're upset about is the apparent confirmation that ours is a voting public who will do what Rupert Murdoch says, or what the Daily Mail says, or what guffawing racist political parties say, even though what they say is immediately provable as a lie, if you even for a moment get your information from anywhere, or anything, or anyone other than them. The dismay is that we know that this is not a country of idiots and racists. But we've been shown evidence that it might be a country of people who will trust the lies of people who think they are idiots and racists. This is causing a global financial catastrophe and it's affecting everyone. Honestly, I'm half expecting some random country to sue us or something to block it from happening. The sentiment of independence was enough to draw the handful of extra votes needed to win the referendum, but it isn't what those voters will get out of the bargain. It's unlikely anyone will be able to enjoy this. If this video gets a lot of comments telling me that I'm wrong, they'll probably be along the lines of stop fear-mongering, it'll get sorted out, everything will be fine in the end as long as you don't scare people, because that's why people aren't investing and that's why the pound is dropping and so on. Maybe. I hope so. I hope so. It's just difficult to believe that the more we find out that the politicians who led us here didn't actually mean to. They didn't want to leave the EU after all. They didn't expect to win. They didn't have a plan for if they did. And now they've all resigned so that someone else has to deal with the repercussions of their actions. The whole thing turns out to be the result of a lot of petty, backstabby squabbling between Eton schoolboys, who turn out to just be in it to win some sort of game of eternal one-upmanship. It's not a brave political battle. It's a load of nasty boys tricking each other so that they can be the one to bring home those precious 10 points for Slytherin. So what can we do? Two possibilities seem to have emerged, and both of them get nobody anywhere, but we're doing them anyway, because if this referendum isn't the time to do something silly to erroneously make yourself feel like you can make a difference, well then when is? Option 1! The yeah, but no option, which is where we discuss the various ways in which the damage could be avoided before it happens. In other words, how to reverse the decision. The referendum isn't legally binding, we say to ourselves, hopefully, and there isn't any sensible real-life way of actually leaving the EU without breaking everything. So if the government wanted to do their job of protecting their citizens, then the only way to do that is either to not kick off Article 50 in the first place so that the actual exit doesn't happen, or else to negotiate a deal for exiting that's so close to what we already have that we feel the least damage, which is another way of saying that we feel the least difference from when we were in the EU and we just sort of carry on kind of as if we still were. This is possible, and there are various ways it could be done, but these are all just discussions of available strategies, things the government could do to make it fine for us all, which very rarely points to what they actually will do. When it comes down to it, option 1 is just to whine about it on Twitter, basically. Option 2, the "oh, what's the point of it all" option, is to discuss how undemocratic option 1 is, and how the decision's been made now, and if the situation was reversed, and the other side tried to find ways to avoid what had been decided by the people, well, then we'd all be screaming about it and protesting, which is absolutely true. There's wiggle room here, in that a referendum, on the one hand, and a democratic vote, on the other hand, are dramatically different things, even if we've been taught to think of them in the same terms, because one is like a picture book version of the other. There's further wiggle room as well, in that it's very, very rare that a decision is made by the people that has an immediate disastrous effect in time for the decision to be legally reversed. This is one of those times. Not only did the pound drop, you can already find stuff in the shops that was 50 quid before the referendum, that's 80 quid now, that's one that I know about. In this particular case I'm talking about luxury items, but let's see what happens with the water. Billions have been wiped off the global market.
I got this wrong, it's actually trillions.
Our country has lost the credit rating that allowed it to operate as the sort of country it was, so we're about to drop significantly in our standards of living, including those who are already at rock bottom. And it's pretty much morphin time for racist thugs. So it's important that we at least look at what options there are. But look is all anyone can do. Because when it comes down to it, option 2 is just to whine about it on Twitter, basically. So we can't do anything. We couldn't before. The Remainers couldn't stop the Leavers from believing the lies that Boris and Gove and IDS and Farage were vomiting in their faces all day. And the Leavers couldn't stop the government from stamping on their faces forever, even with this last-ditch desperate option to change something. Now, as then, all any of us can really do is wait to see what insane thing the dangerous villains that make up the Tory party decide to do to us all next. Except now we have recent, well-documented, visible proof that whatever they choose, it won't be the option that helps the country, it'll be the one that makes for the most advantageous plot point in the House of Cards self-insertion fanfic that's playing out in each of their heads. I just hope, if nothing else, that this finally clears up once and for all what an absolute shower the people in charge of us currently are, and does something to prove that if you ship off a load of babies to a weird, parentless schoolag and teach them that they were born to ruthlessly lead the plebs they're not allowed to play with, without considering how deeply that might damage their ability to empathise with the people they govern, or to even think of us as proper people, then the daftest playground rivalries from decades ago can become the butterfly wing that leads to the catastrophic, country-drowning tsunami that is the absolute history book gold we're currently living through. But then again, while I hope the reputations of this particular bunch of politicians never recovers from this, it would probably be a very bad thing if, because of that, our country lost faith in the whole concept of our democracy. It has big flaws, but every government system does, and ours seems to be one of the more bearable systems most of the time. What needs to change is where we get our politicians from, how we raise them. I've got nothing against there being rich people, but there's obviously something wrong when our government, which supposedly exists for our benefit, is composed entirely of people whose whole world is completely alien to us, and ours is to them. There was once an argument for the Eton system, or whatever it's properly called, the system where future ministers all went to the same couple of really posh schools. If those schools were really good, then it makes sense. We want our future rulers and masters to have the best education that they can. But now we've seen that they're not good schools, or at least they're not fit for this purpose. The pupils from those schools are coming out maladjusted. Maybe they were maladjusted before, but they're not coming out fixed, and that's what the schools should be for. They are giving us future leaders
without empathy who break countries and do monstrous things to the weakest people. We have people who are raised like princes and who are right now, while the rest of us are scared of what might happen to us, they're getting to live out romantic stories about their foolhardy quests and ostracization and power struggles. When it goes wrong, their lives are still grand and they get to go home to their gigantic mansions and stare forlornly, thinking of their losses, out of windows bigger than the house I grew up in. And meanwhile, we just have to wait and see if we can survive in the world those people leave behind. So, in the end, the Remain voters were right that we need stability. And the Leave voters were right that we need something that's actually for us.
www.youtube.com/team